Hello, my friends. I hope that you're having a good day or a good evening, whatever time it might be where you are when you are listening to this. I am really looking forward to sharing this conversation with you. Today, we are diving into sensory processing disorders, and my guest is pediatric occupational therapist Courtney Duckworth-Harris. She is going to describe what exactly is a sensory processing disorder, and she's going to help us understand how sensory processing manifests and how sensory processing disorders interact with other disorders, because that's so important and helpful for guiding treatment and supporting kids. Let's jump in.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Hi, Courtney. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey there, how's it going?
It's going well. How are things with you?
Really well. Thank you so much for having me on.
I'm so glad that you're here. And before we started the recording, I was telling you that there's so many topics I want to cover on this podcast, and sensory processing was one of those topics. And so I'm so glad that you agreed to come on and talk about this topic, because there are so many families who come into my office and parents will tell me that my child has been identified as having sensory issues, or during, kind of when I'm asking questions about symptoms and difficulties and areas of difficulty, there are some clear sensory issues that come up during the process of just speaking with the parent. So thank you for coming on the podcast and having this conversation today.
Most definitely. Yeah. Sensory is such a buzzword right now. It's kind of unclear exactly what it means. And there's a lot of different definitions. So it can be confusing for sure.
Wonderful. Let's just jump in. How about we can start, because kind of what you said, when there's misunderstanding about what it is. So what do we mean by sensory processing?
Well, sensory processing, we all have sensory processing from during our daily lives. We use our visual systems, auditory, tactile, which is touch, vestibular, which is movement. The vestibular system is actually in our inner ear. It tells us balance, where we are in space. And then proprioceptive, which is one of the lesser known, which tells us how fast or hard we move our arms, our body, where we are in space, just that general body awareness. And those receptors are between our joints. And so all of those systems together, when they're functioning smoothly, it's called sensory integration. So they're all integrated, they're working smoothly together, and we can move about our day in a coordinated, calm, regulated way. And as adults, for example, you may feel a little dysregulated because you've been in a really busy, noisy environment. So your visual system was flooded, your auditory system was flooded, and then you feel like anxious or tense or nervous or just uncomfortable. And that's your auditory and visual systems being flooded.
Right. And I think a lot of people can recognize those experiences. Mm-hmm. And so when we're talking about a sensory processing disorder, what do we mean by that? Kind of going from sensory processing, kind of what you've described beautifully, to a sensory processing disorder.
Right. So the disorder part is just that. It's your sensory systems not talking to each other, not relating information directly to your brain smoothly, efficiently. So, for example, as an anecdote, a little 4-year-old who's in preschool, and he's the one doing laps around circle time rather than sitting crisscross next to his friends and listening to the songs or whatever it is. That little guy is probably not processing vestibular input efficiently. So, for example, he needs more movement to feel the same effects as his peers. So he's seeking a lot more, and so he's looking disorganized. Or another little one sitting next to friends is really aversive because friends tend to touch. And if you're tactily sensitive, that's going to be really aversive and maybe send you into a tantrum if somebody touches you unexpectedly, or your clothes feel uncomfortable and itchy and you're constantly just like in a state of irritation. So those are just a few examples. But overall, sensory processing disorder tends to be just a combination of all our sensory systems not functioning effectively.
Right. And it seems that that could happen in any of the senses or a combination of senses. Is that correct?
Yes, most definitely. Yeah, it's not like one child has only auditory or only vestibular. It tends to be a blend of all of them. Auditory, visual, tactile, vestibular, and proprioception. Some kids will be more affected by maybe their proprioception. They're bumping into things. They seem clumsy. They're falling on purpose or on accident constantly. Things like that. So they just present, every child is a little bit different and their sensory systems are going to present a little bit differently, but they tend to be affected by a variety of all the senses.
Wonderful. And now, as we're talking about sensory processing disorders, I've also heard sensory integration dysfunction. Are they the same thing? Are they different?
Yeah. So because sensory processing disorder or sensory integration disorder is not actually in the DSM, so it's not an official diagnosis, you can just kind of call it whatever. Sensory issues, sensory processing. We try to give it like an official label so it sounds more legit, because it really is. And I believe, no research, but I believe that it can exist outside of autism, ADHD. It can exist independently. So I believe it could be its own diagnosis, but it's not yet. So that's why there's no one streamlined name for it. But yeah, it's basically the same thing.
Right. And what we've seen with the DSM are that disorders that weren't in there end up in there at some point. And so it may be that it's not in the DSM now, but later on it may make its way in there as its own independent disorder. Because it seems like sensory issues are comorbid with a lot of disorders that are in the DSM. So even though it's not considered a medical or mental health disorder, it's not in the DSM, which is a diagnostic manual, but that does not mean that kids do not struggle with sensory processing issues, because I've seen them in my practice. You've seen them in the work that you do. And it seems that it's important to understand sensory processing if you have a child who is struggling clearly with those issues, particularly kids on the autism spectrum.
Most definitely. Yeah. I mean, and that's where you see it the most, is those kids with autism. It's like, but then I've even seen a billboard where it said sensory issues can be a sign of autism, which I think is true, but also a huge misnomer, because my little kid, who's very social and sweet and has all these skills, but also has some sensory concerns, all of a sudden the parent's terrified that they have autism. And I think that is a little bit scary, because these kids that are misunderstood in preschool, kindergarten, first grade, and they're struggling, but there's no diagnosis. It just, they might get mislabeled, and then labels can be very beneficial, but they can also be damaging.
Yes. And, even the example you gave at the beginning about the 4-year-old who's running in circles, in the preschool, I'm thinking to myself that also could look like a child with ADHD, but that also points to the idea that kids can have more than one struggle, or a struggle in more than one area. You can have ADHD and also have sensory processing difficulties. If you are not paying attention to something you should be paying attention to, and then also over attending to something else, and also having this hyperactivity at the same time. So there seems to be a lot of overlap.
I definitely agree. I mean, and there definitely are, like, the majority of kids with sensory processing probably do have another concern as well. But a lot of kids in my career that I've seen, they respond really quickly. I actually have a couple kids in my practice right now who they seemed like they actually were assessed for autism, but then it was found that they don't have autism. And they've responded so quickly and progressed so fast with sensory integration therapy in my clinic and through OT, of course. And they've just made so much progress. And kids that say a 7-year-old who has been diagnosed with ADHD, they do benefit from these sensory strategies and the sensory integration style of therapy, but they still present differently. They still struggle with that attention. There's something that these sensory strategies can't fix because it's that extra diagnosis of ADHD, not just the sensory. So it's really interesting. They really do, as you get deep in, they really do present differently.
Right. And that's why understanding what it is that you are seeing is so important, so that you know what is the appropriate intervention or interventions, because many of the kiddos that we see need more support in a number of areas. And we want to make sure that we're addressing, all the areas of concern and not just focusing on one.
Most definitely.
Now, you mentioned a child or children that you may have seen that they were initially thought to have autism spectrum disorder or be on the autism spectrum, but then as it turns out, they had sensory processing issues and not autism. Can you talk a little bit about how kind of the sensory processing difficulties manifest, what that looks like, and then we can kind of move into treatment and what that looks like as well?
Most definitely. So what I'll do is I'll peel apart each sensory system and what a disorder in each of those sensory systems look like. But just remember that they don't exist separate from each other. It's all one big sensory system that plays back and forth. Like, for example, the visual and vestibular systems are very closely interconnected. Mm-hmm. But to make it more clear, I'll just break down each one. So a child with auditory processing concerns will be the ones that are really sensitive to loud sounds covering their ears. They can't go into a public restroom because the automatic toilets are so loud. They also will be those ones that maybe they're sitting with their back to you, playing with something or watching a video or whatever it is, and it seems like they're ignoring you, but they're just not being able to filter. And so they're can only focus on one auditory input, and they're completely just not attuning to you're calling their name or whatever it is. And on the flip side of that is kids that can't focus because they're hearing everything. They can't filter and hone in on, say, in a mildly busy classroom, people are working, shuffling their papers and stuff, but then the teacher's talking to them and they can't focus on what the teacher's saying because all these other extra noises, the clock ticking, somebody walking by, paper shuffling. So that's auditory. Visual is going to be a similar description to auditory, where you're attempting to visually attune to something, but then you see all the other things on the wall or people walking by. You're just really visually distracted by things. So it's really hard to focus on like your sheet of paper in front of you or things like that. And then there's also visual perceptual skills, which goes a lot deeper, but that's going to affect learning to read, identifying letters, finding objects in a busy background. That goes really deep into a whole other side of visual processing, visual perceptual. But for our purposes, mostly that distractibility. And then, so tactile is, I think, one of the more commonly understood because it's a little bit more straightforward. Tactile sensitivity. You see a lot of kids not wanting to wear socks or shoes because they don't like how they feel. They're sensitive to tags on their clothing. They only wear short sleeves because they can't handle long sleeves. They don't like messy play. They refuse to go play in sand, or they don't do finger painting at school because they really hate that feeling on their hands. So those three are a little bit more easily understood and more commonly used in everyday language because we know those systems. And the more misunderstood and less known systems are the vestibular and the proprioceptive. Vestibular, like I said, is in your inner ear, and it tells you if your head is upside down, if you're tilting side to side, if you're spinning. And so kids with vestibular processing concerns will either be hypersensitive or hyposensitive. The ones that are hypersensitive are the ones that are really scared to go on swings. They may not even want to go downstairs or upstairs because their system's telling them that, oh, this is a really big, terrifying movement and you're not stable. And they'll also struggle with balance, hopping skills, things like that. And the ones that are hyposensitive are the kids that look like they might have ADHD, very hyperactive, constantly seeking movement. But with them, they might seek movement, but then that swinging or running increases their arousal level. And so they're even more hyperactive. They're even more excitable and disorganized. And so those are the kids that tend to be a little bit more disruptive in classrooms. And then the last one, proprioception, the ones that are seeking proprioception are the ones that are purposefully falling, crashing, giving too tight of hugs to friends, little brother, dog, like this is a little bit too rough. They're crashing, right. They're always wanting to wrestle. And then the ones that maybe not be processing it as efficiently may have decreased body awareness, seem a little clumsy, not as athletic as their peers, struggling to learn to hop, just not really aware of where they are in space.
It seems like with all of the different kind of manifestations of these sensory processing issues, kids can be over responsive or under responsive.
Yes, that's kind of the key. And then another clear separation is modulation versus discrimination. So if you're struggling with modulation, those are the kids that are either seem really emotionally dysregulated and they're constantly having tantrums and they're not modulating the input that they're receiving. So they're flooded by visual and auditory, or they're flooded by movement, or they're seeking too much movement. They're just not keeping an even keel throughout their day. They're experiencing really high highs or really low lows. They're just bouncing all over the place. They can't just kind of stay even and modulated. And then discrimination, if you're not discriminating vestibular input, for example, your balance and your sensory motor skills will be off. Same with tactile and proprioception. Those are all going to really affect your sensory motor skills, your balance, your coordination, your fine motor skills, all of that. Some of the motor skill systems.
Right. And, as I'm hearing you kind of describe these different systems and how it impacts kids, it just seems that when kids have struggles in these sensory areas, that it impacts so many aspects of their daily lives, from friendships to school. You talk about, being the kid who's falling off the chair at school, or things are too loud, or they're getting too close to their peers, or not liking being touched by their peers, that it impacts so much of their interactions with others at home and at school and on the playground.
It really does. Yeah, sensory processing disorder affects a lot of functional aspects of a kid's life, from their social interactions. They tend to have more tantrums. They maybe miss social cues. So all of a sudden they're focused playing on this activity in the playground, but then all of a sudden nobody's around them because they didn't visually and auditorily attend to their friends around them. They moved on to playing fireman over there instead of in the sandbox or something. So they're missing the social cues, or they are struggling in school. Their handwriting is another big buzzword, another big concern that OT works with is, their handwriting is affected because their sensory systems are affecting their postural stability and their hand strength and all of these things. And their visual processing, they're struggling with learning their letters and numbers, and which goes into more learning disabilities. But still, it touches on all different aspects of life.
Mm-hmm. And, I think about those kids where these sensory issues have not been identified and not been treated. It can actually kind of contribute to anxiety. I can imagine a kid who's being flooded, how anxiety provoking that could feel. And if you're a child who's been already diagnosed with an attentional disorder like ADHD, it could be exacerbated if you also have these sensory processing issues. I'm thinking about difficulties with self-regulation, how that would manifest.
Most definitely. Yeah. I mean, as if you're going around and all the sensory systems of daily life, just simply the ticking of a clock, or your peers walking around the classroom, or swinging on the playground swing, if all these things are just seeming to be such an intense input, such an intense feeling, then simple things of of going around your daily life are going to be very anxiety provoking because you don't know when that next big loud sound's going to come, or you don't know what to expect next because you're not processing the information around you properly.
Right. And it just, as we're having this conversation, this is why I love, connecting with other professionals who are in a different discipline than I am, because I think there just needs to be this understanding of how sensory processing and mental health issues interact, because it just seems that there's, like I was saying, it can exacerbate issues that have already been identified or those that have not been identified, or contribute to things like anxiety, if not understood.
For sure. Yeah. And I think OT in the past, say 5 years or so in general, I think has started delving deeper into the social emotional part of therapy. Not going as deep as a psychologist, of course, but just like you're saying, how the sensory systems affect the social emotional skills and regulation and all of that. And like, for example, I really love using social thinking and zones of regulation, just throughout bits and pieces of it through my therapy, because it really helps balance out, identify how I'm feeling and what my body is doing, and what my body's doing and how that makes me feel, and vice versa, and what other people are doing, and all just how it's interlaced together.
Absolutely.
And what do we do about it?
Yeah, because of that connection. And, you talked about occupational therapy, and I think that that's a really great place to go next, because you've outlined sensory processing, what it is, kind of what makes it a disorder, and how that looks in children and even adolescents and adults who might struggle with sensory processing issues. But let's talk about how occupational therapy helps kids who have difficulties in these areas, because now we can see how it can be beneficial and how to help address those difficulties that they're experiencing.
Right, for sure. So like most therapies, we start with an assessment, and there'll be standardized testing, usually in clinical observations, to look at the motor skills, but also their social emotional reactions to the situation, to the new therapist, just how they react with parents, and then also a lot of parent information from the parents. I like to use the sensory profile, which is a questionnaire that the parents fill out. There's also one for teachers that they can fill out, and that really gives some detailed information about everyday activities and how the kid is reacting. Like, do they wipe their hands a lot during art projects at school because they're tactily sensitive, or are they constantly on the go, or things like that. And so gathering all that information, then I make a very personalized, individualized treatment plan, of course. And those goals will specifically address the sensory systems, the motor skill concerns, the social emotional concerns that we've discovered. And of course, it's going to look different with every child. Like I was saying before, some kids will be perfectly fine with auditory and tactile, but they're also really, really flooded by visual and vestibular. And so they're avoiding a lot of activities and things like that. So basically, once we have those goals, then we'll really hone in on strategies and activities that are going to address those sensory processing concerns and their motor skills and all of that.
And is there an ideal range in terms of age range when kids benefit from treatment?
Gosh, I mean, even some adults could benefit from some strategies, but I like to work with kids about ages 4 to 12 at the max, I'd say, in the clinic. And because I think under 4, it's more of a early intervention style of therapy, which is extremely important and beneficial. And you definitely can do sensory integration therapy with those ages. But I personally like to really specialize in 4+, just because that's when a lot of kids are starting to struggle. That, the social skill aspect of life is increasing exponentially when they go to preschool, and then transitioning to kindergarten. There's a lot more expectations, and it's not just a little 3-year-old running around being silly. They're more expected to sit and attend during circle time and things like that.
Right. And I know that these sensory processing issues can look different in different kids. But can you talk a little bit about kind of what would, an intervention session look like for a child? Maybe using an example of what that would entail. Because I imagine that there are some parents listening who say, this sounds very much like my child, and have questions about, once that's identified, what would treatment entail? Is it in a gym? Is it in an office? Is it, what would that look like? Or could that look like?
Right. Sure. Yeah, I'll give you a general description for sure. So my clinic is, the majority of it is my sensory motor gym. So there's suspended equipment, swings, trapeze. I have a bunch of ropes where I can connect all different types of suspended equipment. And then I have a climbing wall, a whole bunch of pillows and crash pads, a trampoline, and then a fine motor room where we do art and fine motor skills as well. And so a typical session, I usually have the kid come in and we'll make a group plan. So we'll write down what the plan is on the whiteboard. So to kind of keep it structured, flowing and playful, but have a general idea of what to expect, because kids tend to really prefer to know what's going to be expected of them and what the plan is. And it really helps them stay organized. So anyways, maybe the first plan will be an obstacle course where we blend a lot of different skills together. It can include balancing, working on their vestibular system by swinging and throwing a ball into a target, maybe jumping from a short height into pillows to get that crashing, to get that proprioceptive input. I love doing a lot of animal walks, crawling and walking like a bear, hopping like a frog, things like that, because that really activates, the strength, endurance, upper body, lower body, core strength, which we're working on, but then also giving that proprioceptive input, which is very calming and organizing to the nervous system. And then after a few, 3 rounds of our obstacle course, then maybe we'll do a fine motor game where we're working on our maybe beading or a pegboard or color cut glue art project. It really just depends on what the child's skills need to be worked on. Or if they're having visual perceptual concerns, maybe we'll do puzzles or a Where's Waldo book, things like that. Obviously, every child's different, so I can go on and on about different activities. But in general, that's kind of how I structure it. We do half an hour or so in the gym. We're working on our motor skills, our sensory processing, and then we go to the table and we do some art, maybe work on our tactile play with shaving cream or paint, and fine motor skills.
Wonderful. And are there things that parents can do at home to further support the work that kids are doing with you in their one-on-one sessions?
Most definitely. I tend to give, if not home programs, at least a little bit of one activity kind of homework each session. And for example, if the child is really struggling with self-regulation, I'll give calming strategies. So if their little girl seems like they're about to have a tantrum, or, that we're about to go into a trigger situation, I really hate going to the grocery store. It's too bright. It's too visually busy. It's too many people, whatever it is. We're going to do some calming strategies beforehand. We're going to give tight squeezes. Maybe we'll do some jumping jacks. Maybe if we're at home, maybe squishy between some pillows. Because remember, that deep pressure is really calming to the nervous system. Or some heavy work, maybe we'll push and pull a laundry basket filled with heavy stuff around the living room, or things like that, which is really working the muscles. So just calming strategies like that. Deep breathing is always a good go-to.
And I've seen a lot of those calming and those sensory strategies help kids, who may not have even been identified as having sensory issues, but may have been identified as having ADHD or difficulties with self-regulation or emotional regulation. And so a lot of the work that you do in occupational therapy helps kids who've not only been identified with sensory processing disorders, but other disorders as well that impact the sensory system and impact their ability to regulate their bodies and their emotions.
Mm-hmm, for sure. And you have to remember, like I said in the beginning, we all are sensory beings. Every single day, we use sensory strategies for ourselves. Like this morning, maybe you had coffee to wake up, to kind of stimulate yourself. Or
I still have mine.
There you go, right? Or we do yoga at night right after work to kind of calm our nervous system, or we run in the morning to just really get that proprioceptive input going, that vestibular input, that to get that energy out in order to feel calm and regulated for the day. A hot bath at night. All these, we just squeeze all of the sensory strategies into our days. And some kids either don't know how, they're not naturally choosing to do things that are organizing, or they just need more.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of where OT comes in. It's just figuring out what the kid needs and giving them more of it in order to organize and regulate.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I just think that all the information that you shared is so important to so many parents and educators who might be seeing some of these things in their classroom. Parents might be seeing some of these struggles and these difficulties with their kids who they're bringing, like you said, to the grocery store or at home. And I just think it helps for parents to have information, for educators to have this information so that they better understand. And then they can make appropriate referrals for kids who might need some additional support in these areas.
Most definitely.
So thank you so much for sharing this information with our listeners. What is the best way for people to connect with you if they want to follow up and learn more about you and the work that you do?
Sure. I think the most straightforward way would be just go on my website. All my contact information and social media is on there. So that's kinderclinicinc.com. So KinderClinicinc.com.
Wonderful. And I'll put all of that information in the show notes as well. Thank you again, Courtney. I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
I hope you came away with some good takeaways from this episode. And at the very least, I hope you have a better understanding of sensory processing disorders. I'm so grateful to Courtney for coming on the podcast and having this discussion with me. She is one of our Child Nexus professional members, and she's been in the group and in the community sharing information with speech and language pathologists, child psychologists, neuropsychologists, other occupational therapists, and educational attorneys. We are having a great time in that community. And if you would like to know more about how you can be part of that community, feel free to email me at drkiwilson@childnexus.com. Thanks so much for listening. See you next time.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.